Hey everybody, today I'm thrilled to have Sherley on the show. And so Sherley, you're a senior at Middlebury,
Yeah.
and we got connected, I think one kind of through Middlebury, but also two, you're an avid listener to the show, and you
Yeah.
reached out to me with a bunch of really amazing feedback on things where we could do better, on gaps we had. And so maybe I'll turn it over to you, because this will be the first of a few episodes I think that we'll be recording together. Welcome to the Breaking Into Finance podcast. Let's dive in.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be on the podcast, Craig. Thanks for having me. So like Craig mentioned, I'm an avid listener of the podcast. I was first introduced to the podcast when you came and spoke at one of my classes, actually. It was the first finance class I've ever taken as a senior, so pretty late into the game. But you came, you spoke, I loved it. I turned to your podcast, I listened to it for about a week or two, and then I reached out to you. And so we've been working together since. And I kind of, put together a list of podcasts that I'd like to see on the show, like podcast topics. And we decided that a really cool one would be how to digest financial news, especially because there are so many sources and platforms out there that feed out financial information day by day. And so I thought it would be really cool to come on here and talk about some tips on how to navigate that and improve, some skills that are the skill that is really necessary in finance.
Awesome. I think that's a great preamble, and this is such an important topic. I'm really glad you raised this, because I agree it's something we haven't really talked enough about yet, and it is such a crucial channel, not only for understanding and like knowledge. It's important for understanding and hearing other people use this jargon.
Yeah.
And it's also important for just having context on what's going on in current events and in the news, and in demonstrating that this is something that you're interested in. So I know we had a couple questions that you came in prepared with, so maybe we'll start there and we'll see where the conversation goes.
Yeah. So I think, for those who have listened to the first few episodes of Craig's podcast, you kind of start the podcast with saying there is not a single path into finance. And I am definitely not taking the traditional path into finance. Like I said, I'm in my senior year, and I took an interest in finance late into my junior year. So my first class really in finance was this semester, and really getting into it. And so I kind of a question that I wanted to, preface this episode with is, what is financial news? Especially because this looks really different for everyone, depending on what exactly they're trying to get into in finance. On your podcast itself, on the podcast itself, you've spoken about, what does the Fed do? What is investment banking? What are hedge funds? So there are definitely different ways to get into finance. Kind of just, do you have any tips on like what is financial news and how to navigate it?
Yeah. And there's a really wide spectrum here, and I think it ranges from kind of like pop news that touches on finance topics all the way into like hardcore, like like there's like leveraged loan blogs that are like focused on little important but like niches within finance that are just really inaccessible often to students. And so there's a really wide spectrum, but I think it's really about finding the entry point that speaks at a level that is comfortable for you. And so I think breaking into finance, certainly over the course of our episodes, we ramp up the level of sophistication. I think some of the initial episodes are trying to be a little bit more introductory and teach some of the jargon, so that we don't have to redefine every concept we talk about later on. So we are kind of a sliding scale, but just to call out one that is actually run by a couple of older Middlebury alums. There's a podcast called The Best One Yet, that's abbreviated as T-Boy, that is it's a lot more on the pop side, but it's like pop news infused with a little bit of finance and current events. And so they do try to have 1, 2, or 3 takeaways that have a financial bent to it. And so I think that's a wonderful place to get started. One of the guys who runs that is a former investment banker turned full-time podcaster, and that's a daily. So that's something you can interact with regularly. Bloomberg has paid subscriptions, Bloomberg News, but they have 2 different newsletters that are free. then you can just get those in your email every day. So one is called 5 Things You Need to Know Today. I think Charlotte Lawrence, who's a previous guest on this podcast, actually first told me about 5 things, but I think it's a really great place to just see a grab bag of headlines and things that are moving markets. And then another Bloomberg one is called Money Stuff. It's with a guy called Matt Levine, who is like sort of a hero of mine. He's a lawyer, investment banker, turned kind of like financial news. Like he'll get into the weeds on like the legality of, like sort of like random blockchain events and like the possible ways in which like they could go wrong. But he uses very plain and simple language, and it is really well articulated, kind of approachable entry points into pretty dense topics in finance. And so he just is a wonderful explainer of financial concepts. So those, I think, is like a great spectrum of places to get started. And then if you're a student and you have kind of through your school access to New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, I think those are kind of the 2 other biggest like news outlets of ways that you can follow news.
Yeah, those sounds like really, really great sources. You mentioned kind of just having podcasts that you can listen to kind of introduce you to the subject. It's funny you say that because right when I started listening to your podcast, I was in the class, like I mentioned, and the assignment for that night or for that week was looking at like balance sheets and all that. And right into like episode, I think 4 or 5, that was like the first thing you start talking about is like balance sheets. So like that was just perfect timing. For me, I grabbed my notebook and started jotting down notes, kind of understanding the jargon and everything. But kind of moving on to my second question, you mentioned the podcast with Charlotte actually, and in that episode, you kind of talk a little bit about having a view, and that kind of goes into my second question, which is really, do you have any best ways to effectively process financial news? And so in that podcast, you kind of talked about going into looking at the market with a certain view. So can you speak a little more on this? And what is an example of a view that would show really well in an interview?
What a great question. So this is like the perfect example of advice that I got frequently when I was a student and I was trying to break in and I was doing these networking calls with analysts and associates and VPs. And frequently when I'd say like, do you have any advice for me as I'm preparing for interviews, or, what can I do? One of the things that everybody mentioned was have a view, like have a view on the markets, have a view on a stock or something. And I felt really uncertain about what, like, first, like, I don't know what it means to have a view. Like, I don't know, like, what is a sufficiently, sophisticated perspective to have that it counts as a view. Like, can I just say, like, the stock is overvalued? Is that enough? Do I need to explain why? Does my explanation have to be good? You're going in here as a student with all of this information asymmetry where everyone who's interviewing you for these jobs and internships knows so much more than you do. And I just felt really uncomfortable trying to assert, a view or perspective on something to someone who I knew just knew more about these topics than I did. And so what I will say here is that when you hear like having a view, whether it's a view on the market, on the Fed, on a stock, on whatever thing, I'll try to give a couple examples here of like what makes a good take and what makes a bad take. And so, when I think about like what it requires to have a good take and like a good view, the first is perspective of time. And the only way to get that is really just start today, if you haven't yet, of reading headlines. Like, even if you're not clicking into all the articles, just like look at some of these headlines. And that Bloomberg 5 Things is like a great way to get started, where they're like, you're getting headlines pushed to you. Just like know what people are thinking about in January, so that in February, March, April, in a year, in 2 years, you have a reference frame of how people's perspectives have evolved over time. And it can feel really daunting if your time frame is like you have an interview in a month. But even then, just like whatever time dimension you have will just give you context and a little bit more well-informed. So that's number one, start today. 2 is reference frame is everything. So regardless of the level of analysis that you've done and the conclusion that you've come up with, whatever you're presenting needs to be relative to what everybody else thinks. And so for you to have a well-informed view, you not only need to assert, whatever it is, like Tesla's overvalued. That statement, overvalued, means not only that you've done your own analytical work and you've come up with your own valuation, but you also understand where everybody else thinks it's valued and why. And so that is another big element of reading financial news, is you'll kind of get a sense of how the market thinks. And so it may seem like at first you're just kind of like, drinking from a fire hose and there's all this information coming at you and you understand like 70% of what's going on. Yeah. But over time, you'll see somebody say something and you'll think to yourself, like, is that true? Or like, I sort of think that's like probably going to happen, but you're talking about this like this is 100% locked in, and then that sort of confuses me. And so maybe like your view there becomes the market is pricing this in with 100% certainty, and I think it's likely, but not like all the way, certain. So I think these are examples of developing a view. And, then the next thing, and this is like, the icing on the cake, if you can get it, is not just knowing your view and the market's view, and those two things being slightly different, but knowing why the market has that view. And this, by the way, I will say, can be it's surprisingly difficult to see this even in the Wall Street Journal. It's amazing how I think there's this tone in financial news a lot of the time that explains events that happened yesterday or last week as if they were obvious and inevitable. And, they weren't like a week ago. It just like, I think there's this like tone that I see a lot in financial news that it's sort of this like false sense of confidence or explanatory tone. I don't really know how to describe it other than it feels off. And if you find yourself reading an article where there is that tone, don't feel like there are all these like geniuses out there who've like known that this was always going to happen and it was always the case. Because if the market moved, like if some like price and something changed as a result of that news, then I'm telling you that, that some very smart people didn't know that was happening. So that's a little bit of a long-winded answer, but maybe I'll try to go into some specific examples if that's helpful. So some example of a very bad take or a very bad view is I like X company's product, so I will buy their stock. Like I own AirPods, so I'm buying Apple stock. That is kind of, I think, like the first view that a lot of like the first like type of thing that a lot of people develop is I like this brand because I'm a customer, so I'm going to buy the stock. And, but one great example that I hope illustrates why this is, not a great framework of a take to have is I personally love WeWork's office spaces. I work remotely. It provides easy, convenient, affordable space for me to like be in an office setting. And it's flexible and I can be in and out. But a lot of the reasons why I like it as a customer is what makes it such a bad business is that, for the, like, if you just look at the unit economics that WeWork has, like basically they have fixed costs where they're renting, an entire floor from a commercial real estate investor. And then they're trying to break off little pieces of that floor and rent it to me and someone else and someone else. And they're only making money if, it's the space is whatever, at least 80% occupied. And when it's not, they have to drop prices to increase occupancy. But when they drop prices, then now they might have to be 90% occupied or 110%. Like the math might work such that they could never be profitable at that stage. And so that's like a perfect example of like, I love this.
Definitely not
because it's so cheap, but its cheapness makes WeWork, now effectively bankrupt, or in the middle of likely declaring bankruptcy. MoviePass is another one. Have you heard of MoviePass?
No, actually.
So this was a company that they're gone now, but maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, when people still used to go to the movies pre-COVID, they offered a pricing that was like $9.95 a month.
Oh yes,
and you could get like unlimited like movie theater tickets.
Yes. I think Regal does something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like an example of like great for you as a customer, but like terrible business model. So that's like, I think starting with, I like this company and I like their brand. It's a good starting point to developing a view in that company. But if you're just saying that and you're leaving it there, terrible take. Slightly better, but still a bad take would be something like healthcare is going to structurally grow as the baby boomer generation ages, or generative AI is changing everything. You've identified trends, but if that's just your logic, you're a buyer of whatever that thing is at any price, right? So if you're saying like baby boomer generation's retiring, so we should invest in services that are purchased by retirement communities. That's a good idea.
Yeah.
But if you're just saying you should buy it, then that logic holds whether the price of that thing is, 100 or $1 million or infinity. You're a buyer at any price. And so that is a great identification of a trend, but you haven't quite gotten there yet on kind of describing value. And so good takes need context about what the market thinks, why the market thinks that way, an original opinion that differs from that market view, even if it's small, and an actionable way to profit if you're correct. And so I'll give like one example of a take or like a view that I heard recently that I think is a smart one, which is that it has been true for a while. There's like all of these smart home products. I don't know if you've like used any or
like Alexa and stuff like that. Like Google Home
like
and Alexa,
like Nest, even like smart refrigerators, smart outlets, smart lights. There is so these smart appliances have been around for a number of years, and they didn't take off the way that people thought. And I think one of the big value propositions to these businesses is that the smart appliances can save people on energy costs. But people, like most people, don't really know how to quantify that energy savings. Like you get like a monthly electric bill, but it's all like it's $1 number, and it's hard to know like, did this smart bulb and this smart lamp like save me how much, in energy consumption or whatever. And so one thesis that I heard recently is that the catalyst for getting people to track energy consumption on a more granular level in their home is the investment in electric vehicles. And so as people buy Teslas or whatever other electric vehicle, there's an app that monitors the charge of that car, but you can also use that same app and environment to monitor the energy consumption of all of your appliances. And so the like kind of like investable like thesis here is basically being a buyer of branded smart home appliances whose, like have been products that have been on the market for a few years and they work and they're growing, and find a good brand because consumers are increasingly going to demand smart appliances as they now have a way of tracking energy consumption in their home. Yeah.
Would you consider the Ring home like a smart home appliance? Because
yes,
I think that's definitely one that
Ring is like a connected home thing.
Yeah.
But it doesn't quite fit into the energy savings thing. Like this would be more like a smart refrigerator, but it does fit into just like broadly appliances that are connected to an app that, now you might care about and use, whereas before it just like isn't worth the effort.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, now you have apps where you can like turn on your car and start heating it up before you even get in there. So like, yeah. Well, thanks for that. I think that was a lot, very helpful information I will definitely be using. So kind of moving into, you spoke a little bit about following trends, but like really having a view on it. And so obviously, this kind of speaks to how much amateur versus professional news that you're taking in. What would you say the ratio is for professional to amateur news that you take in, and how important is it to have that balance?
I guess what would be an example of amateur news?
I guess amateur news would be news that isn't solely based on facts and kind of speaks more to trends, or doesn't look specifically at, I don't know, like if you're talking about stocks, like doesn't maybe look specifically at stocks, but kind of just like what are people doing socially.
So I would say that this ratio, if you're new to the space, I would try to stay away from the amateur takes as much as possible, because it's hard to evaluate the validity of what they're asking. As you get more sophisticated, I think everything is great. So there's no right ratio, and you're welcome to consume as many amateur takes as possible. But until you have a good reference frame for how, a professional, investor or investment banker or news organization might evaluate a topic, you run the risk of believing something that an amateur suggests that just isn't true. But I think like those amateur takes are wonderful to read once you do feel like you have that ability to discern those, because you can critique them more easily. Like it starts to build those skills of like seeing something that you disagree with and being able to formulate why you disagree with it. And I think that can be like a really powerful and helpful thing, especially when you're a student and it's hard to like disagree with the Wall Street Journal, right? So it's kind of nice when you see a take where you're like, no, like this is a terrible take. And so sometimes when it's more like amateur news, it's easier to find, the holes or to disagree with something.
Yeah.
So I'd say
think it's interesting. Oh, sorry. No, so it's very interesting that you say that, because I think for me it was very much the opposite when I really, really first got into finance. I would kind of listen to really amateur, just like YouTube channels or like podcasts, and I think that in turn is what really got me into finance, because then I started picking at things and I was like, I don't know how true this is, and then I think that's when I started to follow up on more professional news. But I guess that's again just reiterating the fact that there is no simple path to going into finance, and kind of everyone consumes things differently.
The best I can say is, if you're just starting with only like, whatever TikTok finance news, then you run the risk of running into like all the like crypto Web3 stuff. And I think like that's an example too, where you like, I saw something on LinkedIn yesterday where someone was talking about, Ethereum's growth potential in the context of had broken like 10 billion of revenue, and they got to 10 billion of revenue faster than any other company or organization in its history. And if you just don't have like levels to like critique that or like poke into it more, you're just like, oh wow, this is amazing, like this is fast growing, it's like actual revenue, this is now actionable. And there are all of these follow-up questions. It's like, well, like, a lot of that is distributed, it's revenue, not profitability. So if you're looking at the dollars that Ethereum distributes to whoever is like receiving that revenue, then you need to understand their costs and like the energy costs associated with the transactions they need. Like, they're just like follow-up questions you need to ask before you conclude just on the basis of revenue growth that this is all of a sudden this exciting, enduring, and valuable enterprise. And then even if it does have value, it's like, okay, but is it worth like the sum total of, what the market says it is? So there's just like subsequent levels of analysis that are required that you often don't get just in kind of amateur news.
I agree 100%. I don't know if you ever got a chance to watch, there's on Netflix, I think it's called Dumb Money or Stupid Money or something like that. But it's, have you watched it?
I've seen the previews for it, but I haven't watched the whole movie.
Yeah, no, you should definitely watch it. I don't know why I kept thinking about it when you were talking about like kind of following trends versus like looking at what other people are saying, because that was kind of like the odd man out a little in that.
Yeah. This is such a fascinating example. And by the way, the like slightly pre-social media version of this movie is The Big Short. Have you seen The Big Short?
Yes.
So They're both examples,
yeah.
I think, of someone or like some small group of people who were not in the mainstream who noticed something. Like, I think like GameStop started with this insight with GameStop that Ryan Cohen, who had this tremendous success at Chewy, kind of warding off competition from Amazon in a way that kind of no one else had, was joining GameStop's board. And I think that was kind of the initial insight of like, hey, like maybe there's this brand that's this well-known brand, and maybe this is the right operator to come in and uncover value. And then all of the meme stock stuff with like them and like games, like there's a lot of other stuff that piled on after that. But that fundamental initial insight, like I think, GameStop at the time probably was a little bit undervalued, and it wasn't 10,000% undervalued, but maybe it was 10, 20, 30, 40% and like a real, dollar figure. And the Big Short is like another, example of that, of like people looked into the US housing market and, looked into the way that rating agencies were rating some of these bonds, and were like, hey, there is just a big mismatch here between what I think the value of this bond is and the value of this loan and, the credit rating that, these rating agencies are ascribing to it. And so I think it is really important to check out these kind of like amateur opinions, because even if the percentage of them that are right and well-informed is small, the impact of those small ones can be really high. And by the way, it's valuable even to read the wrong ones, just so you can critically evaluate someone else's view. And there might be, you might disagree with their takeaway, but you might think to yourself, oh, it's like an interesting perspective. And I'm glad that I learned about that counter perspective, or something that will cause me to reevaluate my own priors.
Yeah. So I've been consuming more financial news mainly through podcasts and reading articles, like the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg. But I found it really difficult to pick up a book and kind of just read through, one, because obviously it's a lot longer, it's a lot more time consuming. But two, because I'm having a really hard time finding a book that I'm interested enough to read from start to finish. So I was just wondering if, when you were getting into finance or along the path, were there any books that you recommend that really stood out and you said, wow, this was really worth my time?
So unfortunately, I didn't. And this is one of the reasons I started the podcast, is like this, like seriously, when I was coaching students, like this is a question I got a lot, is like, what good resources are out there? And there was nothing free, basically. Like nothing was free. And even in books, I bought a few, and I benefited the most from like mergers and acquisitions, and like Poets and Quants have like guides for like interview prep that have like practice questions. But there just wasn't a good book out there that I liked that kind of taught me some of this stuff. I will give one book that I know now that it might be a little dense if you're breaking into it for the first time, but I think it's a really wonderful read. It's called Margin of Safety by an investor named Seth Klarman. The like original hard copies of this book, it's like a limited run. There's like he has like sort of a cult following because he's like a really brilliant guy. He runs this fund outpost. So don't go out and buy like a hard copy that costs like $1,000. Like seriously, it's like crazy expensive.
Oh wow!
Buy like a PDF online, because you can still get the same content without, paying for the collector's item value. But I think that's one that I would recommend.
Yeah, great. I think that's a huge alleviating moment for people to know that they don't have to pick up a book and read it from start to finish to understand finance. So thanks for that. Saving me a lot of time. So you mentioned, instead turning to like podcasts or like just financial news in general, like newsletters. So I kind of wanted to know, you have a podcast. What podcasts do you listen to? What have you been listening to for maybe inspiration or, just to tune in?
The only podcast that I listen to religiously is The Daily, which isn't all financial news, but I think they do a really good job and it's really interesting. So that's the one that I listen to without fail. And then in terms of other finance related podcasts, that's kind of really it. One podcast that is somewhat interesting, but is only relevant for a subset of this audience. There's a podcast that used to be called Cartoon Avatars that is now, it's now called The Logan Bartlett Show. He like renamed it. So if you look up Logan Bartlett Show, it's the same one. Some of the interviews he does are kind of interesting, but that was like an example of like, he's like a managing partner at a venture capital fund. And I wanted to, in some ways, learn from his style of interview topics and like questions that I'm trying to bring some of that in here. But really money stuff, that Matt Levine thing, and then the 5 things you need to know today, like those are like the 2 daily things that I will always look at, and Wall Street Journal headlines every day. And then usually, we'll read a few of the articles.
Yeah, kind of a follow-up. This is the question of the century. Are you an Apple Music user or a Spotify user?
I mostly use Spotify, but I like them both, but I am a Spotify person. I don't necessarily know why I am, but I am.
Yeah, for me, I think it's just oddly easier to just navigate, I think. I don't know. Yeah, kind of just started using it and never stopped.
Yeah. Same.
So I think we've touched on a few, but what would you say your top 3 sources for financial news are, and why?
Wall Street Journal, they have the greatest breadth and volume of cheap news.
Yeah.
Bloomberg is wonderful, but it is more expensive, and usually, like, I think Wall Street Journal does a lot of free stuff for students, like free like student subscriptions or like subscriptions to school, that Bloomberg does less of. So those are the top 2. I say Wall Street Journal first only because it's usually cheaper for students. Yeah. And then, New York Times, like those are kind of the 3 that I trust day in and day out.
Yeah, my list is pretty similar. New York Times definitely up there. Wall Street Journal as well, for very similar reasons, just because it's a lot cheaper. But my third one is a little different. I listen to the Morning Brew Daily a lot.
Oh yes,
and they preface like Yahoo Finance news, and so just because like they're constantly speaking about it on the podcast itself, I kind of just like chime in and look at whatever news they're posting. So those would be my top 3, but yeah, very definitely.
Morning Brew is a really good one. Yeah, I personally don't listen to that as regularly, but I certainly could, and that's no knock against them. Like I think that's a great resource as well.
Yeah. Well, that's it for the questions that I have. I don't know if there's anything else you want to touch, but this has been really helpful.
Well, Shirley, I know what your other list of episode suggestions are. So we have a lot more ahead of us. So I guess first I'll just say thank you so much for coming on and sharing these thoughts and topics with everyone. I think that does it for today's episode, and excited for the next few.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. It was a pleasure, and I can't wait for the next one.
That does it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening, and remember to check out our website, breakingintofinancepodcast.com, where you can submit questions, join our Substack to stay up to date on new content releases, and much, much more. We'll see you next time.